Welcome to Vyrath, a wrecked planet glowing green with toxic lakes and howling winds, where the galaxy's wildest showdown is about to explode. Meet Jace Nolan, a rugged human commander with a ripped shirt clinging to his chiseled chest, green eyes burning with defiance as he holds the line against the Galactic Coalition, fighting for a crystal that could change everything. Then there's Zilara, a lethal Zilara mercenary wrapped in a silver suit so tight it hugs every curve, from her full chest to her swaying hips and thighs that could crush steel. She's got a touch that kills, a flirty voice that heats up the air, and a mission to take Jace down. But when their hands meet, bam, sparks fly, and that deadly buzz turns into something hotter, something neither can resist. From a fortress standoff to a cave where their bodies press too close to stop, they're tearing down walls, hers built from a life of isolation, his from months of loss. Now, with a coalition ship roaring overhead, they're not just fighting for Vyrath, they're fighting for each other, defying the stars in a tangle of heat, grit, and a deal too wild to break. Ready for a sci-fi romance that's as dangerous as it is steamy? Let's dive in. If this clash of fire and defiance hooked you, don't miss a second of Jace and Zilara's journey. Hit that follow button and smash subscribe right now. I'm dropping more chapters packed with action, heat, and twists you won't see coming. Join the crew, turn on notifications, and let's defy the stars together. See you in the next one. It's the year 3147, and the galaxy's a wild, messy playground. Out in the Zilara belt sits Vyrath, a beat-up planet that's seen better days. Once a bustling hotspot full of alien cities, now it's just a wreck. Gray mountains jutting up like broken teeth, toxic lakes glowing green and mean, and winds howling like they're out for revenge. Underneath all that mess lies Vyrath, a sparkly crystal that's got everyone in the galaxy drooling. And stepping into this chaos is Zilara, a mercenary from Zilara who's about to shake things up big time. Her dropship rattles down through the stormy sky, touching the ground with a thud, and out she comes, a vision that'd stop anyone in their tracks. Zilara's not just any fighter, she's a walking storm, wrapped in a silver armor suit that clings to her like a second skin. It's tight, real tight, hugging every curve and muscle she's got, and trust me, she's got plenty. Her lavender skin glows soft in Vyrath's dim light, shimmering like it's got a life of its own, smooth and flawless, begging you to look closer. The armor dips low at her chest, showing off a hint of her full, rounded curves, just enough to tease without giving it all away. It cinches at her waist, tiny and firm, then flares out over hips that sway with every step, wide and strong like they could knock you over and you'd thank her for it. Her legs are long, powerful, the kind that stretch out forever, thighs thick and toned, flexing under that shiny suit as she moves. And when she turns, oh man, her backside's a masterpiece, round, high, and bold, the armor barely keeping up with it, making every stride a little show all its own. Her long black hair whips around in the nasty wind, falling past her shoulders in wild waves, brushing against her collarbone and teasing the tops of her curves. It's messy, sexy, like she just rolled out of a fight or something else and didn't care to fix it. Her white eyes burn bright, like little flames that could melt you if you stare too long, set in a face with sharp cheekbones and full, pouty lips that curve into a smirk when she's feeling dangerous. She adjusts her stance, one hip cocked to the side, letting the wind play with her hair, and it's hard not to notice how she owns every inch of this wrecked planet just by standing there. Zilara, find the last human commander and take him out, a rough voice buzzes through her earpiece. Her boss from the Galactic Coalition, some alien hotshot who thinks he runs the show. Vyrath's ours once he's gone. She grins, slow and sly, her fingers sliding over a sleek black gadget on her belt, an energy booster that's gonna make her even deadlier. She's got this trick, see, she can zap the life right out of you with one touch, a little gift from her Zilara blood. He's gonna drop before he knows what hit him, she murmurs, her voice low and smooth, dripping with a flirty edge that'd make your cheeks heat up just hearing it. Her boots crunch over old bones littering the ground, each step a little strut, hips rolling like she's daring the universe to try her. The ship's hatch slams shut behind her, leaving her alone with Vyrath's eerie quiet. She takes a deep breath, the sharp ozone stinging her nose, but it only makes her feel sharper, hotter. The sky's a mess of gray and green, those glowing lakes bubbling down below like they're alive and ticked off. The mountains tower around her, rough and jagged, but they've got nothing on her. She's the real danger here. Back on Zilara, she grew up dodging trouble and kicking tail, turning herself into a weapon nobody could touch. Literally. Her powers a curse to no hugs, no close calls, just a trail of bodies who got too near. She's fine with that, though being alone's her thing, keeps her tough, keeps her free. But as she starts walking, that tight suit shifting over her curves, something flickers in her chest, not fear, but a little thrill she can't shake. She tightens her grip on her pulse blade, a slick weapon that hums blue when she flicks it on. It's not her big move her touches, but she likes the backup. Her heart's beating faster now, not cause she's nervous, but cause she loves this, the hunt, the rush, the moment before it all goes down. It's the closest she gets to feeling alive. Outside the cold winds she stacks up. Zilara doesn't do soft, she's all edges and fire, but Vyrath's weird vibe is creeping into her, making her think about stuff she usually pushes away. Like how those hips of hers, swaying with every step, have never brushed against anyone without ending them. Or how her hands, strong and deadly, have never held anything gentle. She shakes it off fast, tossing her hair back with a flick, letting it tease her shoulders again. Up ahead, a busted-up fortress sticks out of the mess, walls scratched and half crumbling from old fights. That's where he's at, the human she's here to finish, Jace Nolan, the guy who's kept Vyrath out of the Coalition's claws for months. She's gotta give him props, he's got guts, holding out this long. What's he like, though? Big and tough? Maybe kinda cute in a scrappy way? Her lips curl into that sly smirk again, imagining him flat on his back, staring up at her curves in that historic. She's not vain, well, maybe a little, but she knows she's a knockout, and that's her edge. People get lost looking at her, and that's when she moves in for the kill. She pauses for a sec, checking her gear one last time. Her silver armor's scratched from old scraps, but it still fits like a dream, showing off her killer body, those long legs, that tiny waist, those hips that could stop traffic. She rolls her shoulders, feeling the stretch in her muscles, and takes a step toward the fortress, boots kicking up dust. Her thighs flex under the suit, strong and smooth, and her hair swings with her, brushing her skin like a tease. The air's cold and sharp, biting at her nose, but it just wakes her up more, makes her feel alive and ready. Zilara's not just here to win, she's here to own this fight. The human doesn't have a clue what's coming, a walking, talking firestorm with a body that'd make anyone blush. That tight suit shifts with her every move, hugging her hips, her thighs, her everything, and she knows it's a weapon all its own. Whatever's waiting in that fortress, she's ready to take it down, and maybe have a little fun doing it. Jace Nolan stood on top of the broken fortress, boots planted firm on the cracked stone, the wind howling around him like Vyrath itself was throwing a fit. Dust stuck to his sweaty skin, streaking down his tanned arms where his beat-up armor had ripped open. The tears in the fabric showed off his chest, hard and broad, muscles flexing under the strain of holding his plasma rifle. His dark hair clung to his forehead, messy and damp, and his green eyes squinted into the distance, tired but tough as nails. He'd been fighting the Galactic Coalition for months, losing everything, his squad, his hope, but he wasn't about to let Vyrath go. This wrecked planet, with its gray mountains and glowing toxic lakes, was his last stand, and he'd go down swinging if he had to. He shifted his stance, feeling the ache in his legs from too many sleepless nights. His rifle rested easy against his shoulder, barrel still warm from blasting at shadows that never seemed to stop coming. The Coalition had taken out his crew one by one, and now it was just him, the last guy crazy enough to hold the line. He'd heard rumors about their new weapon, some alien mercenary who could kill with a touch. Sounded nuts, but after seeing his buddies vanish, he wasn't so sure. Still, Jace wasn't the type to scare easy. He'd faced bigger messes and walked away with a grin. But as he scanned the hazy horizon, his gut twisted a little, warning that something big was headed his way. Then he saw her. A figure slipped through the fog, moving fast and smooth, like a panther on the hunt. Jace gripped his rifle tighter, heart kicking up a notch. She stepped into view, Zilara, and man, she was a sight that hit him like a punch. Her lavender skin glowed soft under Vyrath's dim light, smooth and shiny with a thin sheen of sweat that made it look like she was carved from starlight. Her silver armor was scandalously tight, hugging every curve like it was painted on, full chest spilling just a bit at the top, tiny waist flaring out to hips that rolled with every step, and legs that went on forever, thighs thick and strong under that shimmering suit. Her backside, round and bold, swaying like it had a mind of its own, daring you to stare. Her long black hair danced wild in the wind, brushing her shoulders and teasing the edges of her armor, and those white eyes locked onto him, bright, fierce, and hot enough to melt steel. Jace's breath caught, and not just cause she was trouble. She was drop-dead gorgeous, the kind of gorgeous that'd make your face heat up and your thoughts stumble. He shook it off quick, lifting his rifle to aim. Pretty or not, she was here to end him. "You're the last one," she said, her voice sliding over him like honey with a kick, smooth, low, and way too flirty for someone about to fight. It sent a shiver down his spine, and he swallowed hard, trying to keep cool. "Lucky me, huh?" he shot back, smirking even though his pulse was racing like crazy. He squeezed the trigger, but she was too fast, way too fast. In a blink, she was on him, her body closing the gap like a storm rolling in. Her hand slammed against his chest, fingers splaying wide over the rips in his armor, brushing his bare skin. Her touch was hot, scorching, and a jolt ripped through him, like fire racing up his veins. He stumbled back, boots scraping the stone, expecting to hit the ground dead. But instead, he felt alive, crazy, wild alive. His vision snapped sharp, his muscles buzzed with energy, and he landed hard, gasping, hands clutching where she'd touched. The heat lingered, tingling under his skin, and he looked up, half dazed, to see her drop to her knees a few feet away. Zilara was breathing heavy, one hand pressed to her chest right where her suit dipped low, showing off those curves like she was trying to hold herself together. Her white eyes blinked up at him, wide and shaky, her pouty lips trembling just a bit. "What are you?" she said, her voice cracking, soft and raw, like she couldn't believe he was still there. Jace pushed himself up, heart pounding like a drum, his shirt sticking to his chest where her hand had been. "Guess I'm not your average catch," he said, voice rough but teasing, flashing a grin to cover how thrown he was. He stepped closer, drawn in by that buzz still humming through him. Her touch should have killed him, but here he was, feeling tougher than ever. Zilara stood slow, her black hair clinging to her sweaty lavender skin, falling over her shoulders and brushing the tops of her chest in a way that made his throat go dry. Her hips shifted as she moved, that tight suit showing off every sway, and her white eyes flicked over him, not just mad anymore, but curious, maybe even a little hungry. "No one lives through that," she muttered, her fingers twitching like she wanted to reach out again, her voice low and sultry, sending heat creeping up his neck. He brushed dust off his hands, stepping nearer, grin widening as he caught her staring. "Maybe I'm built tougher than you figured," he said, leaning in a bit, close enough to see the sweat beading on her skin, smooth, shiny, and way too tempting. Her armor glinted in the dim light, hugging her thighs and hips like it was showing off, and up close, he could feel the heat rolling off her. Jace's fingers itched to touch her back, to see if that jolt would happen again, but he held off barely. She took a shaky breath, lips parting like she was stuck on what to say, and her white eyes softened, locked on his green ones like she was seeing something new. "You're not scared," she said, almost surprised, her voice dropping even lower, flirty in a way that made his face flush. Jace chuckled, easy and low, letting his eyes linger on hers a little too long. "Takes more than a knockout like you to scare me," he said, his tone teasing but honest, green meeting white in a stare that felt like a spark waiting to catch. She didn't back off, just tilted her head, her hair falling over one shoulder, brushing her chest again, and stepped closer, so close he could smell her sharp ozone mixed with something warm and sweet that hit him right in the gut. "What's your deal, huh?" he asked, voice dropping, flirty but curious, leaning in just a bit more. "Come here to zap me, and now what? Round 2. She didn't answer right away, just stared, her hips cocked to one side, that suit showing off every curve like she knew he couldn't look away. The fortress creaked around them, Vyrath's green glow painting everything spooky, but Jace didn't care. Whatever she'd done, it wasn't normal, not for her, not for him. And standing there, with her so close he could feel her heat, he had a feeling this was just the start, and maybe he wasn't mad about it at all. The wind screamed through Vyrath's rocky canyons, kicking up dust and howling like the planet was throwing a tantrum. Jace stood on the busted fortress roof, still reeling from that wild zap Zilara had hit him with. His chest buzzed where her hand had landed, like tiny fireworks popping under his skin, and he wiped his sweaty palms on his torn pants, green eyes glued to her. She was pacing now, moving slow and smooth, every step a little show. Her lavender skin shimmered in the dim light, slick with sweat that made it glow like she was lit from the inside. That silver armor hugged her tight, real tight, showing off everything she had, a full chest that strained the suit just a bit, a tiny waist that flared out to hips that swayed like they were daring him to look, and thighs so strong and curvy they could have crushed him if she wanted. Her backside rolled with each move, round and high, the armor barely keeping up, and her long black hair swung wild, brushing her shoulders and teasing the edges of her curves. "Touching me should have ended you," she said, her voice low and smooth, sliding over him like a warm tease that made his neck heat up. It wasn't loud, but it felt close, like she was purring it just for him. Jace grinned, brushing dirt off his hands, trying to play it cool even though his heart was pounding like crazy. "Maybe I'm special," he said, stepping closer. Something about her pulled him in, those hips, that glow, those white eyes burning into him like she could see right through him. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing, but didn't back off. He reached out, slow and easy, letting his fingers brush her shoulder where the armor met her skin, smooth, hot, and alive. A warm jolt shot through him, not painful, just hot, like a spark that made his breath catch. Zilara froze, her full lips parting in a tiny gasp that hit Jace right in the gut. Her white eyes softened, flickering with something wild, surprise, maybe heat, and it made his face flush. "You're not weak," she whispered, her voice dropping low and sultry, like she was peeling him apart with every word. Her fingers slid up his arm, light and teasing, tracing the hard muscle under his ripped sleeve, lingering just long enough to send a shiver racing through him. Jace grabbed her wrist, not rough, just firm enough to pull her closer, his breath brushing her neck and messing up her hair. "And you're not as tough as you act," he said, voice rough but warm, letting his fingers tighten a little, feeling her pulse hammer under his thumb. They were close now, super close, the air thick and buzzing like a storm was about to break. Her lavender skin felt hot under his hand, her heartbeat racing where he held her wrist, and that tight suit showed off every inch of her hips curving out, thighs pressing together as she shifted. "This can't happen," she whispered, but she didn't pull away. She leaned in a tiny bit, her white eyes locking with his green ones, so bright they made his head spin. Jace's thumb rubbed her wrist, slow and soft, making her shake just a little, and he leaned closer, their faces inches apart. "Feels pretty real to me," he said, voice deep and flirty, close enough to catch that sharp ozone scent off her skin mixed with something sweet that made his cheeks burn. Zilara's breath hitched, her free hand twitching like she wanted to grab him but wasn't sure where. She'd spent her life pushing people away back on Zilara. Touching was a death sentence, and she'd turned it into her strength. No one got close, no one lasted, and she liked it that way. But Jace? He was standing there, grinning like he didn't care, not dropping dead, not even blinking. It messed with her, stirred up stuff she didn't know how to handle, warm, wild stuff that buzzed under her curves and made her want to step even closer. "You're not scared," she said, almost like she couldn't believe it, her voice soft and flirty now, sending a shiver down his spine. Jace chuckled, low and easy, his grin spreading wide. "Takes more than a knockout like you to scare me," he said, letting his eyes linger on hers, green crashing into white, a look that felt like a dare and a promise all at once. She didn't answer, just kept staring, her pouty lips parted like she was caught between running and jumping in. Jace saw it the way her tough shell was cracking, letting something soft peek through. He'd fought plenty of hard heads who'd break under pressure, but Zilara was different, strong, yeah, but with the heat under all that armor he wanted to touch. "What's your deal, huh?" he asked, keeping it light but curious, leaning in more. "You come here to zap me, and now what? Gonna try again?" His hand slid up her arm, brushing her shoulder again, then down a little, fingers teasing the edge of her suit where it hugged her curves, testing that warm spark that made his face flush harder. Zilara's white eyes flashed, and for a split second, he thought she'd pull back. But nope, she stepped closer, so close her chest brushed his, her hips tilting just enough to press against him. Her breath hit his cheek, warm, quick, a little shaky, and it sent heat racing up his neck. "I don't know," she said, quieter now, her voice flirty in a way that made his heart skip. Her hand moved to his chest, resting light but firm, feeling his heartbeat thump fast under her fingers. It was like she was testing him back, seeing how far this crazy thing could go, her curves pressing closer, that suit showing off every sway of her hips and thighs. Jace's hand slid down her arm again, brushing her elbow, then resting light on her hip, feeling the heat through the tight silver fabric. "Guess we're figuring it out together then," he said, grinning like he wasn't totally hooked on how good she felt this close. Vyrath kept doing its thing around them, the wind howling, the green glow from the lakes painting everything eerie. The fortress creaked under their feet, old and worn out, but it didn't matter. Right now, it was just them, tangled up in this moment with the whole messed up planet watching. Jace could still feel that buzz from her touch, sinking into him, making him sharper, stronger. He didn't get it, none of this was normal, but he wasn't complaining. Zilara's hand pressed harder against his chest, her fingers curling a little, like she was feeling it too, her white eyes searching his face with a heat that made his breath catch. She'd come here to take Vyrath, to wipe him out, simple, clean, over. But now, she wasn't sure anymore. Jace wasn't like the others, those guys who'd scream or bolt or just drop when she got near. He was still here, grinning at her like danger was a game, and it threw her off. Her whole life, she'd been the one calling the shots, the one who didn't need anybody. But now, with his hand on her hip and hers on his chest, she felt something new, something warm, messy, and a little scary, but so good it made her want more. "What are you doing to me?" she muttered, barely loud enough to hear, her voice a flirty whisper that made his face burn. Jace tilted his head, grin softening into something real. "Same thing you're doing to me, I bet," he said, his breath brushing her ear, sending a shiver down her neck that made her lips twitch almost a smile. For a second, they just stood there, caught in this wild spark, and Vyrath's wind faded into nothing. Something was starting, and neither of them wanted it to stop. Night fell over Vyrath, turning the sky into a dark swirl of gray and green. The creepy glow from the toxic lake slipped into the cave where Jace and Zilara had ended up, lighting it up just enough to see. They ducked in here after their little standoff on the fortress, needing a spot to catch their breath or maybe just figure out what was going on between them. The air inside was cool but heavy, smelling sharp like ozone with a hint of damp rock. Jace sat on a flat stone, his plasma rifle leaning against the wall, his legs stretched out in front of him, boots scuffed and dusty. Zilara settled across from him, a little lantern flickering between them like a tiny campfire, casting soft shadows over her face. She tugged off her shoulder armor, letting it clunk to the ground beside her. Her lavender skin shone in the dim light, smooth and sweaty from their clash, catching the green glow in a way that made her look almost unreal. Her black hair fell in messy waves, brushing her collarbone, and her white eyes glowed soft, not so fierce anymore. Without that armor piece, her silver suit hugged her even tighter, showing off her strong shoulders and the curve of her hips like she was tough and soft all at once. Jace couldn't stop staring, his hands itching to reach out. He rubbed the back of his neck, trying to play it cool, but his eyes kept drifting to her, taking in every little detail. "Why'd you come here?" he asked, keeping his voice easy, like they were just chatting over a snack. Zilara's eyes flicked up to his, bright and honest for once. "To win. To take it all," she said, leaning forward a bit. Her hair slipped over one shoulder, dangling there, and she didn't bother fixing it. "But you." Her hand hovered near his, then landed on his chest, fingers spreading light over where his heart was thumping fast. The touch sent a warm buzz through him, like it always did, and he caught her hand, sliding it up so she could feel his warmth through the rips in his shirt. "Good mess or bad mess?" he asked, his other hand reaching out to brush her cheek, slow and soft, following the sharp curve of her jaw down to her neck. She gasped a little, her eyes fluttering shut for a second as his touch sent a shiver through her. "I don't know," she whispered, leaning closer, her lips brushing his ear just enough to make him feel it hot and teasing, like she didn't even mean to. "But I like it." Jace's hand moved to her neck, fingers slipping into her hair, pulling her in so their breaths mixed warm, shaky, full of little sparks. "Watch what you start," he said, his voice rough and flirty, their faces so close he could see every flicker in her white eyes. The lantern's light danced over them, making her lavender skin glow even more, and Jace's heart kicked up a notch. Zilara's breath was quick now, her hand pressing harder against his chest, feeling his heartbeat thump under her fingers. She shifted closer, her knee brushing his thigh as she adjusted on the stone, the contact light but enough to make him notice. Her silver suit stretched over her legs, and Jace's hand dropped from her hair, sliding down to rest on her shoulder again, then lower, brushing her hip where the armor curved. "You're not like the others," she said, her voice soft and a bit shaky, her fingers curling against his chest. Jace grinned, his hand lingering on her hip, feeling the warmth through the thin suit. "Good thing, huh?" he said, his thumb tracing a slow line along her side, making her breath catch again. She didn't pull back, instead, she leaned in more, her shoulder pressing against his chest now, her leg shifting so her thigh rested lightly against his. The heat between them was building fast, and Jace couldn't help but slide his other hand down, brushing her knee, then up a little to her thigh, keeping it gentle but close. "What's this doing to you?" he asked, voice low, watching her face for any hint of what she felt. Her lips twitched, almost a smile, and her white eyes softened, locking onto his like he was all she could see. "I don't get it," she said, her hand sliding up to his shoulder, gripping it lightly, "but I don't want to stop." Her fingers dug in a little, feeling the muscle there, and Jace's grin turned softer, real. He leaned in closer, his forehead almost touching hers, his hand moving from her thigh to her waist, pulling her just a bit nearer. "Me neither," he said, his breath warm on her cheek, sending a shiver down her neck. Her hand slid down from his shoulder, brushing his arm, then resting on his hip, her touch light but bold. The cave felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in, but they didn't care. Zilara's tough shell was cracking. She'd come to Vyrath to fight, to win, but now she was here, letting this human get under her skin in a way she'd never let anyone before. Her leg pressed a little harder against his, her hip warm where his hand rested, and she tilted her head, her hair brushing his chest. Jace was hooked. Her touch, her voice, the way she looked at him like he was a puzzle she wanted to figure out. His fingers tightened on her waist, feeling the curve of her hip under the armor, and he couldn't shake how much he liked it. "Your trouble," he said, voice low and teasing, his hand sliding up her side to her shoulder again, brushing her bare skin. Zilara's white eyes flashed, and she leaned closer, her thigh shifting against his, her breath quick and warm on his ear. "Maybe," she whispered, her hand moving to rest on his leg, just above his knee, "but you like trouble." The lantern hummed between them, the green glow flickering over their faces, and for a moment, they just stayed there close, warm, tangled in something new and electric. The cave on Vyrath was quiet now, the wind outside muffled by thick rock walls, leaving just the hum of the little lantern flickering between Jace and Zilara. The green glow from the toxic lake slipped in, painting everything in a spooky light, but it couldn't touch the heat building between them. Jace sat on a flat stone, his torn shirt sticking to his chest, showing off the hard lines of his muscles, broad shoulders, strong arms, a body carved from fighting and surviving. His green eyes watched her, sharp and steady, but there was a flicker in them now, something hotter than just curiosity. Zilara stood across from him, her silver armor glinting in the dimness, hugging her like it was made to tease. Her lavender skin shimmered with sweat, smooth and glowing, and that suit, man, it didn't hide a thing. Her full chest pushed against the fabric, her tiny waist flared out to hips that curved like a dream, and her thighs, thick and toned, shifted as she moved, drawing his eyes every time. She'd ditched her shoulder armor earlier, letting it clunk to the ground, and now her long black hair fell in wild waves, brushing her collarbone and teasing the tops of her curves. She stretched a little, rolling her shoulders back, making her chest lift and her hips tilt just so enough to make Jace's face heat up fast. He rubbed the back of his neck, trying to play it cool, but it was tough with her standing there like that, all power and heat wrapped in a body that could stop a war or start one. "How come I feel tougher with you?" he asked, voice low and rough, his hand reaching out to grab her wrist. His thumb brushed her skin, feeling her pulse thump hard, and he couldn't shake the buzz that hit him every time they touched. Zilara stepped closer, her hips swaying slow and smooth, her thighs flexing under that tight suit as she closed the gap. The air in the cave felt thick, heavy with something electric, and her white eyes locked onto his, burning bright and wild. "I don't get it," she said, her voice soft and husky, dripping with a flirty edge that made his cheeks burn. "But I need you for it." Her hand slid to his chest, fingers spreading over his shirt, pressing just hard enough to feel his heartbeat racing under her touch. She leaned in, her hair brushing his shoulder, and her hips bumped his knee as she shifted light, teasing, but enough to send a jolt through him. Jace's hand tightened on her wrist, pulling her closer, his other hand landing on her hip, feeling the curve through the silver fabric, warm and firm under his fingers. She didn't pull back, instead, she pressed in, her chest brushing his, her thigh sliding against his leg as she adjusted her stance. "I'm supposed to take Vyrath," she said, her breath warm on his ear, sending a shiver down his neck. "The coalition sent me to wipe you out, get the virus in, all of it. But if I fail?" She trailed off, her white eyes flickering with something raw, and her hand slid up to his shoulder, gripping it tight, fingers digging into the muscle there. "They'll ditch me or worse." Jace's hand moved from her hip to her waist, pulling her in until her curves pressed against him, her lavender skin hot where it brushed his arm. "So what's the deal?" he asked, voice rough and flirty, his fingers tracing the line of her waist, making her breath catch. "You want me to stick around?" Zilara's lips twitched, almost a smile, and she leaned closer, her thigh pressing harder against his, her hips tilting so his hand slid lower, brushing the edge of her curve. "Stay with me, she said, her voice low and pleading, but still flirty enough to make his face flush. We could fight them together, take them all down. Her hand moved from his shoulder to his chest again, sliding down slow, fingers teasing the rips in his shirt, brushing his skin just enough to make him tense. Jace grinned, his hand tightening on her waist, pulling her so close her chest pressed firm against his, her hair falling over his shoulder like a dark curtain. You want me to ditch my crew for you? He asked, but it wasn't mad, just shaky, full of heat, his breath brushing her cheek as he leaned in. Her white eyes softened, locking with his, and her hand slid to his side, resting on his hip, fingers curling there like she was claiming him. No, she whispered, her lips so close to his ear he could feel the heat of her words, for us. Her thigh shifted again, pressing against his leg, warm and bold, and Jace's other hand moved, brushing her knee, then sliding up just a bit to rest on her thigh, strong, smooth, and way too tempting under that suit. The buzz between them flared, not just in his chest now, but everywhere, his hands, his skin, his whole body lighting up where they touched. Your trouble, he said, voice low and teasing, his fingers tightening on her thigh, feeling the muscle flex under his grip. Zilara's breath hitched, and she tilted her head, her hair brushing his chest, her white eyes burning into his with a heat that made his heart skip. Maybe, she said, her voice a flirty whisper that sent heat racing up his neck, but you're not running. Her hand on his hip slid up a little, brushing his side, teasing the edge of his torn shirt, and she pressed closer, her curves molding against him like she didn't want an inch between them. Jace's grin turned real, softer, and he leaned in, his forehead brushing hers, his hand sliding from her thigh to her waist again, pulling her tight. Not a chance, he said, his breath warm on her cheek, sending a shiver through her that made her lips part just a bit. The cave's green glow flickered over them, the lantern humming quietly between their knees, but it couldn't cut through the heat they were throwing off. Zilara's tough act was crumbling. She'd come to Vyrath to win, to crush him, but now she was here, pressed against him, her hips and thighs warm where they touched, her hands roaming like she couldn't stop. She'd never let anyone this close back on Zilara, closeness was death, and she'd built her life on keeping everyone out. But Jace was breaking through, his touch waking something wild in her, something she didn't want to fight. What's this mean? She muttered, her voice shaky but flirty, her fingers curling against his chest again, feeling his heartbeat thump fast. Jace tilted his head, his hand on her waist sliding up to her shoulder, brushing her bare skin where the armor didn't cover. Means we're in this together now, he said, voice low and warm, his thumb brushing her collarbone, making her breath catch again. Her white eyes flashed, and she pressed closer, her thigh sliding against his, her hips tilting into him, every move screaming heat and want. Together, she echoed, her voice a whisper that made his face burn, her hand sliding to his back, fingers teasing the edge of his shirt, brushing his skin just enough to make him tense. They stayed like that, locked in the moment, her curves against him, his hands on her, the buzz between them growing stronger. Vyrath's wind howled outside, rattling the cave, but in here, it was just them, tangled up in a deal that wasn't just about fighting, it was about them, and neither of them wanted to let go. Vyrath's green sky glowed weird and wild outside the cave, casting a spooky light over the rocky walls as Jace and Zilara slipped away from the lantern's flicker into a darker corner. The air was thick with that sharp ozone smell, but it couldn't cut through the heat rolling off them now. Jace's torn shirt clung to his chest, showing off every hard line of his muscles, broad shoulders, strong arms, a body that screamed he'd fought his way through hell and back. His green eyes burned with something fierce, locked on Zilara like she was the only thing in the universe. She stood there, silver armor glinting in the dimness, hugging her like it was daring him to look. Her lavender skin shimmered with sweat, smooth and hot, and that suit, oh man, it left nothing to guess. Her full chest pushed the fabric tight, her tiny waist curved out to hips that swayed with every breath, and her thighs, thick and bold, flexed as she moved, pulling his eyes like a magnet. She took a step closer, her long black hair swinging wild, brushing her collarbone and teasing the tops of her curves full and round, barely held in by that silver suit. Her hips tilted just a bit, a slow roll that made Jace's face heat up fast, and she didn't stop, kept coming until she was right there, pressing him back against a jagged rock wall. Her hands landed on his chest, fingers sliding under the rips in his shirt, brushing his bare skin hot, teasing, feeling the hard muscle underneath. "I don't know what love is," she whispered, her voice low and husky, dripping with a flirty edge that made his neck flush. Her lips brushed his jaw, warm and so close he could feel her breath, "But I want it with you." Her hips pressed against his, her curves molding tight, and Jace's hands shot to her waist, gripping her hard, fingers digging into the silver fabric over her hips. "Your trouble," he growled, voice thick and rough, pulling her closer until there wasn't an inch between them. His hands slid down, brushing her hips, then lower, resting on her thighs, strong, smooth, and way too tempting under that suit. Her breath hit his neck, hot and fast, as she pressed harder, her chest pushing against his, her hair falling over his shoulder like a dark wave. "And I'm into it," he added, his fingers tightening on her thighs, feeling them flex as she shifted, her body warm and bold against him. Zilara's white eyes flashed, wild and bright, and she tilted her head back, her full lips parting just a bit, her hair brushing his chest as she moved. "Show me," she said, soft and flirty, her hands sliding up his chest to his shoulders, gripping tight, fingers digging in like she couldn't let go. Jace's hand moved up her thigh, slow and firm, brushing the curve of her hip again, then sliding to her waist, pulling her so tight her curves pressed everywhere, chest, hips, thighs, all of her molding against him. His other hand tangled in her hair, tilting her head back just enough so their eyes locked, hers white and blazing, his green and burning with heat that made his face flush hard. Her breath was shaky now, her lips so close to his he could feel the warmth, and her hands slid down his arms, brushing his sides, then resting on his hips, fingers curling there like she was staking a claim. "You're making this hard," he said, voice low and teasing, his thumb brushing her waist, teasing the edge of her suit where it hugged her skin. Zilara's lips twitched, almost a smile, and she pressed closer, her thigh sliding against his, warm and firm, her hips tilting into him like she wanted every bit of him. "Good," she whispered, her voice a flirty purr that sent heat racing up his spine, her breath brushing his ear again, making him tense. Her hands moved, one sliding to his back, fingers teasing under his shirt, brushing his bare skin hot, light, enough to make his breath catch. The buzz between them flared up, wild and electric, not just where they touched, but everywhere, like their energy was mixing, sparking, pulling them tighter. Jace's hand on her waist slid up, brushing her side, then resting on her shoulder, his thumb brushing her collarbone, feeling her shiver under his touch. She'd come to Vyrath to fight, to win, to take it all, but now she was here, pressed against him, her body screaming heat and want. Back on Zilara, she'd never let anyone this close. Touching was death, and she'd built walls higher than these mountains. But Jace was tearing them down, his hands on her, his breath mixing with hers, waking something wild and messy she didn't want to stop. "You're changing me," she muttered, her voice shaky but flirty, her fingers curling against his back, brushing higher, feeling the muscle there. Jace grinned, his hand sliding from her shoulder to her neck, fingers brushing her skin, warm and soft under his touch. "Same here," he said, voice rough and warm, pulling her closer until her chest pressed tight against his, her hips rocking just a bit against him. The green glow flickered over them, the rock wall cold at his back, but all he could feel was her heat, her curves, her breath. Zilara's thigh pressed harder against his, her hips shifting slow, teasing, and her white eyes burned into his, full of something raw and hot that made his heart pound. "Don't stop," she whispered, her voice a flirty plea that made his face burn, her hands sliding down his back to his hip again, fingers gripping tight. Jace's hand in her hair tightened, pulling her head back just a bit more, his breath brushing her cheek, then her neck, sending a shiver through her that made her lips part wider. "Not planning to," he said, voice low and thick, his hand on her thigh sliding up again, brushing her hip, feeling the curve under his fingers. They were tangled now, her chest against his, her thighs pressing his legs, her hips locked with his, hands everywhere. The buzz between them wasn't just a spark anymore, it was a fire, racing through them, making every touch hotter, every breath shakier. Zilara's hair brushed his chest as she shifted, her curves molding tighter, and Jace's hands roamed her waist, her hips, her thighs, feeling every inch of her like he couldn't get enough. She'd never felt this, never let herself, and now she was lost in it, her tough shell gone, replaced by something wild and warm she wanted more of. "What's this?" she breathed, her voice flirty and shaky, her fingers teasing his back again, brushing his skin. Jace tilted his head, his breath warm on her ear, his hand sliding up her side to her shoulder, brushing her bare skin where the armor didn't cover. "Us," he said, voice low and real, his thumb brushing her neck, making her shiver harder. Her white eyes locked with his, and she pressed closer, her thigh sliding against his, her hips tilting into him, every move screaming heat and want. They didn't pull back, couldn't, and the cave faded away, Vyrath's green glow just a backdrop to the fire they were building, too close, too hot, too good to stop. A coalition ship roared overhead, its engines shaking the grey ridge where Jace and Zilara stood, the green glow of Vyrath's sky casting wild shadows over them. The wind whipped around, tugging at Jace's torn shirt, showing off his broad chest and hard arms, muscles tense from the fight he knew was coming. His green eyes burned, locked on the ship, then flicking to Zilara beside him, and that fire softened into something hotter, something just for her. She stood tall, silver armor glinting like a second skin, hugging every curve she had, and man, she had a lot. Her lavender skin shimmered with sweat, glowing under the eerie light, and that suit clung tight, full chest pushing the fabric, tiny waist flaring out to hips that curved bold and wide, thighs thick and strong like they could carry her through anything. Her backside swayed just a bit as she shifted, round and high, pulling his eyes every time she moved. Her long black hair danced in the wind, brushing her shoulders and teasing the tops of her curves, wild and messy in a way that made Jace's face heat up fast. She'd put her shoulder armor back on, but it didn't hide a thing. Her body was all power and heat, and those white eyes of hers glowed bright, fierce but warm when they met his. Their hands were locked tight, fingers tangled, her skin hot against his, sending that buzz through him like it always did. "Go back to your people," she said, her voice steady but laced with something soft, something that made his chest tighten. Her fingers squeezed his, her hips tilting just a bit closer, and Jace pulled her in, his free hand sliding to her face, brushing her cheek slow and soft, his thumb teasing her full lips, pouty, warm, and way too tempting. "No way," he said, voice rough and warm, his breath brushing her hair, messing it up more as he leaned in. "I'm staying 'cause you've changed me." His hand slid from her cheek to her neck, fingers brushing her skin, hot and smooth where the armor didn't cover, and he pulled her closer, her chest brushing his, her hips pressing against him. Zilara's white eyes flickered, softening into something raw and hot, and she leaned into him, her forehead resting against his, her lavender skin burning where they touched. "Then we fight together," she said, her voice a flirty whisper that made his face flush, her lips so close he could feel the heat of her words. Her hand slid to his chest, fingers spreading over his shirt, feeling his heartbeat thump fast, and her hips tilted again, pressing tighter, her curves molding against him like she didn't want any space left. Jace's hand on her neck moved down, brushing her shoulder, then sliding to her waist, gripping her hard, fingers digging into the silver fabric over her hip. "Together," he echoed, voice low and thick, pulling her so close her full chest pressed firm against his, her thighs brushing his legs as she shifted. Her hair fell over his shoulder, teasing his skin, and her other hand slid to his back, fingers brushing under his shirt, hot and light against his bare skin enough to make his breath catch. The buzz between them flared up, wild and electric, racing through every spot they touched. His hands on her hips, her fingers on his back, their bodies locked tight. "Your trouble," he said, grinning, his thumb brushing her waist, teasing the curve there, making her shiver just a bit. Zilara's lips twitched, almost a smile, and she pressed closer, her thigh sliding against his, warm and bold, her hips rocking slow and teasing against him. "Maybe," she whispered, her voice flirty and shaky, sending heat racing up his neck, "but you're not letting go." Her hand on his back slid higher, brushing his skin, fingers curling against his muscles, and her chest pressed harder, her curves warm and soft where they met him. Jace's hand on her waist slid down, brushing her hip again, then resting on her thigh, strong, smooth, and way too hot under that suit. "Not a chance," he said, voice rough and real, his breath brushing her ear, sending a shiver through her that made her lips part wider. His fingers tightened on her thigh, feeling it flex as she leaned in, her body screaming heat and want. The ship's engines faded into the distance, demanding Vyrath, but it didn't matter, they weren't listening. The wind howled around them, tugging at her hair, making it brush his chest again, and Zilara tilted her head, her white eyes locking with his, burning with something fierce and soft all at once. "You're mine now," she muttered, her voice flirty and low, her hand sliding from his back to his hip, gripping tight, fingers digging in like she was claiming him. Jace grinned, his hand on her thigh sliding up to her waist again, pulling her closer, his other hand brushing her shoulder, then her neck, teasing her skin with his thumb. "Same goes for you," he said, voice warm and thick, leaning in until their breaths mixed, hot, shaky, full of sparks. Her thigh pressed harder against his, her hips tilting into him, and she shifted, her chest brushing his again, her curves molding tight like she couldn't get close enough. Jace's hands roamed her waist, her hips, her thighs, feeling every inch of her, his fingers brushing her skin where the armor left it bare, hot and smooth under his touch. Zilara's tough shell was gone now. She'd come to Vyrath to take it all, to crush him, but here she was, tangled up with him, her body pressed against his, her hands on him like she'd never let go. Back on Zilara, she'd built walls no one could climb, but Jace had torn them down, his touch waking something wild and warm she didn't want to lose. "What's this mean?" she whispered, her voice flirty and shaky, her fingers teasing his hip, brushing his skin just enough to make him tense. Jace tilted his head, his breath brushing her neck, then her ear, his hand sliding up her side to her shoulder again, brushing her bare skin. "Means we're a team," he said, voice low and real, his thumb brushing her collarbone, making her shiver harder. Her white eyes flashed, and she pressed closer, her thigh sliding against his, her hips rocking into him, every move screaming heat and want. "A team," she echoed, her voice a flirty purr that made his face burn, her hand sliding to his chest again, fingers curling against his shirt, feeling his heartbeat race. The buzz between them wasn't just a spark now, it was a fire, racing through them, making every touch hotter, every breath wilder. They stood there on the ridge, locked together, her chest against his, her thighs pressing his legs, her hips tight with his, hands everywhere. The green sky glowed above, the wind howling around them, but it couldn't touch what they had. Zilara's hair brushed his shoulder as she shifted, her curves molding tighter, and Jace's hands stayed on her waist, her hips, her thighs, feeling her like he couldn't get enough. She'd come to conquer, but now she was conquered not by Vyrath, but by him, by this thing they'd built together. "We'll take them all," she said, her voice flirty and fierce, her lips brushing his ear, sending a shiver down his spine. Jace grinned, pulling her closer, his hand on her neck, his breath warm on her cheek. "Damn right," he said, voice rough and warm, and they stood there, tangled up, ready to face the stars together.